Signed by a Ghost by William Edmund Fillory. Warren Elmer was hanged for a crime he did not commit. His mutilated spirit came back in search of the man who was responsible. Signed by a Ghost by William Edmund Fillory. I used to be frankly skeptical of supernatural narratives, whether I read them in newspapers or heard them from intimate friends. But one Saturday night, shortly after the execution of my bosom chum, I underwent a startling and terrifying experience that made me call all my former prejudices into question. Even to this day, I sometimes find it difficult to convince myself that it was not entirely some hideous nightmare, or that I was not the victim of a horrible mental aberration or hallucination. But whether I suffered from an overwrought imagination, or whether the ghastly happenings of that night were actual occurrences, the fact remains that I was confronted the following morning by something gruesomely real that lay in the passage adjoining my bedroom, and on my bureau was the significant, blood-stained document which I had been given the previous night. But I had better begin at the first of my grim narrative, and relate the ensuing weird and unearthly details in the order of their event. My wife had gone to visit for a week with relatives, and I was staying alone in our cottage. After a late improvised meal, I settled down in my armchair in the living room, and intended to enjoy a pleasant evening of reading. Presently, in spite of my interest in the novel I had picked up, I found my mind wandering off into thoughts of my dead chum, who had been hanged unjustly for a crime of which he was innocent. While I was thinking of him, the light in the room suddenly went out, and I was left in darkness. For a moment I thought that the fuses had blown, but the light came back on again an instant later. A few moments afterward, the light went out a second time, and several minutes elapsed before it came on. Now, I'm not temperamental, nor am I of a nervous disposition, but when the light flickered and died a third time, an uneasy, inexplicable feeling began to creep over me. This time, the light must have remained extinguished for at least 15 minutes. During the interval, I, of course, was sitting in complete darkness. Just before the final return of the light, I could have sworn that something cold and clammy brushed against my face. Merely a touch, a momentary sensation, and it was gone. But it had chilled me to the bone. I was assailed immediately by a nauseating sensation, and obsessed with a stifling feeling of fear. I found myself shuddering involuntarily as the light leapt on again. There seemed to be something uncanny in the very air. I had a feeling of I cannot explain what, but my flesh felt as one's does when the body is cold and goose flesh forms on its surface. However, I was not cold, for it was a balmy night in June. It was several minutes before I regained sufficient composure to continue reading. No sooner had I begun to get interested in my book again, however, than I was parsimoniously startled by a harsh and insistent ringing of the electric doorbell. With some speculation, for I was not expecting anyone to visit me that evening, I placed my book upon the table and went to answer the summons. Before I could reach the door, the bell had commenced to ring again in violent, spasmodic peals. I wondered at the impatience of whoever might be responsible for this racket, and by the time I got to the door, it was more than half inclined to anger at this impudence. "What the deuce do you mean by—" I began as I threw the door open. But I was cut short by the threatening attitude of a stout man of medium height, who stood on the porch. In his right hand he held a revolver, with which he menaced me as he advanced a step nearer and stood in the doorway. The light from the chandelier in the corridor disclosed to my gaze a homely, rotund face, embodying coarse, brutal features, and I observed that there was a livid scar on his left cheek. Thus, for an instant, we stood eyeing each other. Then I suddenly came to myself. "What do you want?" I demanded sharply, keeping a wary eye upon his weapon as I spoke. I thought that it must have been his intention to rob me, and I was quickly trying to formulate some plan of outwitting him. "Shut up," he rasped. "If you yell out, I'll plug you." I quite believed that he would have plugged me without hesitation if I had called for assistance, so I wisely decided to remain quiet. "Might I ask just what your intentions are?" I ventured, as he motioned me to back into the passage, and, crossing the threshold quickly, closed the door behind him. He still held the revolver steadily aimed at me. "You've got nothing to be scared of," replied my captor gruffly, "as long as you don't try any tricks. I'm not going to rob you, and I won't kill you, unless you force me to," he concluded with an ugly chuckle. "Well, why are you here? And to whom am I indebted for this social call?" I inquired caustically. "Get into that room," he nodded meaningly towards the living room in which I had been reading. "And don't let your hands drop anywhere near your pockets while you're doing it," he commanded, an ominous note in his voice. "Better stick 'em right up. I'm taking no chances." I did as he ordered, and he followed me cautiously into the living room. "Sit down," he said, and grunted surlily. "Might as well make yourself comfortable while I'm here." I sat down in my armchair. The stranger drew up a chair opposite and seated himself. Never, to my recollection, had I seen this man before, and despite all attempts at conjecture, I could not fathom the reason for his dramatic visit to me. However, I curbed my curiosity and waited patiently for him to enlighten me. "It's like this," began the stranger, settling himself more deeply into his chair, but not for a moment relaxing his vigil, nor allowing his aim to stray for even a second. "You don't know me, and probably don't want to know me, but I am going to introduce myself and tell you what made me come to you tonight. My name is Howard Dean, but that doesn't mean anything to you. I don't suppose you ever heard it before, but what does mean something to you, as a friend of Warren Elmer, is this. I know something about the shooting of Peter Hawks, and I want it off my chest right now. Warren Elmer? Warren was my friend hanged a few days ago. What did this man know of him and of our friendship? I immediately recollected that, of course, he could have learned of our close friendship from the newspaper accounts of the trial, as my name had been mentioned prominently in connection with the battle to obtain Warren's freedom. And Peter Hawks? That was the name of the man who had been murdered, and Warren had been accused of the crime and sentenced upon circumstantial evidence. What do you know about my friend? What do you know about the tragedy of which he was convicted? I cried, springing to my feet in my excitement. "Sit down," fairly bellowed this man Dean. Then, as I hastily obeyed, "Keep cool," he admonished. "I don't want to be caught here. I know this much. Warren Elmer was innocent of that job." "How do you know that?" I queried, although I had been certain all along that Warren's protestations of innocence were genuine. That he simply could not have committed such a crime, I knew intuitively. "I know because..." "Because..." Dean hesitated. Well, there's no use beating around the bush. I killed Peter Hawks. You killed him? I was astonished by this sudden confession. But why have you come here to confess this to me? I asked. Dean twisted uncomfortably upon his chair. Then he looked straight at me. It's like this, he explained. Ever since I shot Hawks, not that I regret it, not a bit of it, the dirty devil, I've felt worried about it. I didn't feel so bad until Ulmer swung for what I did. But when they strung him up, I couldn't forget about it. I keep thinking of it, no matter how hard I try to forget. It has tortured me, nearly driven me insane, and I can't stand it any longer. I've decided that I would have to confess to someone. It's conscience, I guess, although I don't know why it should worry me so for killing that cur. He double-crossed me 2 years ago, and then disappeared. But I swore I'd get him sooner or later, and I did. I've laid awake nights thinking. My God, it's been terrible. He groaned as though he was filled with anguish at the recollection. Why don't you go to the police and confess? I suggested, a little gently, for I felt a bare degree of compassion for the man's evident agony of mind, even though I could not overlook the fact that he was a self-avowed slayer of a human being, and that his silence had caused my best friend to be led to the gallows. Dean shook his head. I couldn't, he said. I didn't have enough nerve to give myself up. But I had to sell someone, so I've come to you. Here. He tugged at the interior of his coat and produced a folded sheet of paper from his breast pocket. This is my written confession. Signed. Give it to the police and clear the name of your dead friend. I took the proffered document. Read it, said Dean as he helped himself to one of my cigarettes from the table. I read it and found it to be, as he stated, a signed confession to the murder of the late Peter Hawks. Now that you've given me this, what do you intend to do? I interrogated. I'm going to beat it, vouchsafed Dean briefly. Don't try to follow me. I don't intend to be taken alive. And with this reply, he was as good as his word, getting to his feet and continuing to cover me with his weapon as he backed out of the living room. Then I heard him running, as swiftly as his bulk would permit, along the outer corridor. A moment later, the front door slammed, and he was gone. I did not attempt to follow him. I knew that to do so would be foolhardy and futile. When I was alone again, I decided that I needed the solace and stimulus of tobacco, so I secured my pipe and some tobacco from the table, and sat down to smoke and think over the queer visit of Howard Dean, the murderer. For about half an hour, I suppose, my brain was active with mingled thoughts of the dramatic visit and confession of the murderer, the unhappy fate of my late chum, and what might be the outcome of my taking a written confession of Howard Dean to the police station in the morrow. And I had not forgotten the weird incidents of the lights, the clammy thing brushing against my cheek, and the feeling of horror and the awareness of something supernatural which had pervaded my entire being. Abruptly, my mental speculations were put to flight, for I was alarmed suddenly by the sound of a dismal, hollow moan, which came from the passage without. My scalp tingled, and I could feel the blood receding from my face. The sounds seemed to be approaching gradually nearer to the closed door of the living room. Fascinated, yet horrified, I kept my eyes focused upon the door. I knew that it was going to open presently, and it did. What then I beheld in the doorway caused a cry of horror to well up and die within my parched throat. The incident of the light, the clammy touch in the dark, and the subsequent visit of Howard Dean all had tended to make me high-strung. But now this frightful apparition, was almost more than I could bear. I covered my eyes with my arm, but immediately I did so, I felt compelled by some psychic power to look again. Then I recognized its features. It was the ghost of my friend, Warren Elmer. He wore the garb of a condemned man, and there was a noose about his neck. The rope had left its bloody mark on one side of his throat. I was too terrified to speak. Semi-exhausted, I sat down further into my armchair. I watched paralyzed, while the thing came steadily toward me. The dreadful shade of Warren Elmer halted barely 3 paces from me, and stood regarding me with a frightful, solemn gaze. I felt that I wanted to shriek, and to rise and run from the odious phantom which confronted me, but I could do neither. My throat seemed to have become contracted, so that my voice was merely a hoarse, gurgling whisper, and I was incapable of moving my legs, as if my feet had been implanted or glued to the floor. Peculiar noises were ringing in my head, and I felt weak and dizzy. Then, like a ship's siren moaning through a dense fog, the sepulchral tones of the spectre fell upon my ears. "You have nothing to fear, Will," it said slowly. "I have not come to harm you. Why do you fear me so?" I licked my dry lips and gritted my teeth as I tried to shake off my terror and reply. After what seemed to me an age, I managed to blurt out, in a voice entirely foreign to my own, a disconnected reply. I can't help feeling scared," I gasped, and my voice became a little stronger as I exerted a greater effort of control. "I know you will not harm me, but you look so ghastly, Warren." The spectre emitted a hollow laugh, but it seemed to die when only half uttered, and change into a dismal wail, which was followed by an agonized groan. I shuddered violently at the awful contrast. It was terrible. "For heaven's sake, Warren, don't groan like that," I cried. "I can't stand it. You will drive me insane." The spirit lifted its arms upward, then dropped them again, accompanying the action by a slight drooping of its head, as if in despair. "I cannot help myself," said the ghost. "Until I have punished the man whose silence caused my death, I must continue to suffer untold agonies, and my spirit will never rest. You must try to bear with me patiently, and overlook my involuntary groans. This is the last time you will see me upon this earth." Then, with frequent interpolations of horrible groans, the apparition continued, and I braced myself, and bit my lips until I drew blood, while I listened. I was innocent of the murder of Peter Hawkins, but, as you know, I was hanged while the assassin escaped unpunished, said the spirit. But I have learned since death the identity of the murderer, and I followed him tonight, invisible, to your house. He cannot escape my wrath. I shall settle accounts with him before I leave this house forever. I knew you were innocent, Warren, I interrupted, and it was not long since the real murderer was here. But I'm afraid you are too late to settle with him here. He is gone, and I don't expect he will return, for, after holding me at bay with a revolver, he gave me a written confession to the murder, and then made his escape. Here is the confession. And I took the piece of paper from the table, unfolded it, and held it out for the wraith for his inspection. The spectre chuckled grimly. Without another sound, it extended one of its pale arms and snatched the paper from my hand. Then, suddenly drawing the noose tighter about its own neck, the ghost passed a finger across its throat, thereupon wiping off 2 drops of blood, which it flecked with a quick motion onto the document, immediately below the signature, as if in endorsement. The phantom reversed the paper, held it out for a moment so that I could see it, and then replaced it in silence on the table. "You have no fear that the murderer will escape," asserted the spectre. "I know, for all knowledge is accessible to the dead." "And have you appeared to me to enlist my aid?" I gasped. The spectre shook its head. "No," it replied, "I need no earthly assistance. I came merely to let you know that justice is about to be done, and to forewarn you in case you unwittingly interfere with my object, and so come to grief. You are my friend, and I would not have you suffer at my hands. But, in order to avoid the possibility of this happening by accident, it is necessary for me to appear to you and give you warning before leaving you forever. I must leave very soon." "Then there is nothing I can do?" I asked, a trifle relieved by the assurance that the ghost of my friend was soon to depart. "Nothing, save to obey my instructions carefully," answered the spectre. "You must retire to your bedroom immediately, and do not leave it on any account during the rest of the night." Although rather puzzled, I readily agreed to comply with the wishes of my departed friend, for I felt I wanted, more than anything else at the moment, to be alone. "Then I suppose this will be farewell, Warren?" I said. "Yes, goodbye, Will," replied the ghost. "May we meet again upon the other shore, from which there is no complete returning. Go now, and do not forget what I have said." These were the last words which I ever heard the spectre utter, and, as I rose unsteadily to my feet, it stood aside to let me pass, and I staggered and reeled rather than walked from the room. Badly shaken, I climbed the stairs to my room. I got into my bed without troubling to remove my clothes, and attempted to sleep, but I could not succeed in losing consciousness. I was in a nervous agony, and I did not know what monstrous thing to expect next. About 10 minutes, I imagine, after I had climbed into bed and let myself sink exhausted upon the mattress, I heard a dreadful wail, and then a blood-curdling shriek, which seemed to come from immediately outside my door. This was closely followed by a heavy thud. Then everything was silent again as the tomb. I sprang out of bed, turned on my lights. My first mad impulse was to dash wildly from the room, but I became terrified at the thought of what I might encounter outside my door. Next, I thought of jumping through the window, but fortunately refrained from executing this rash intention, for, had I carried out my resolve, I must surely have injured myself seriously, perhaps killed myself, upon the spikes of the iron fence below. Finally, I decided to lock the door and remain on alert until daylight. It was a nerve-wracking ordeal, waiting for the slow, dragging minutes and the seemingly never-ending hours to pass. I smoked cigarette after cigarette until the air became heavy-laden with fumes. Streams of icy perspiration were trickling across my forehead and down my face, and my hands shook unsteadily until my knees felt numbed and weak, when the dawn broke at last, and the first rays of external light crept into my room. I rose shakily from where I had been sitting upon the side of the bed, and stumbled to the door, but I was so weakened that I staggered against it, and fell to the floor in a heap. Then I must have lost consciousness. When finally I regained my senses, sunlight was streaming through my window. I felt stronger, and, summoning to my aid all the moral courage I could muster, I scrambled to my feet, turned the key in the lock, and opened the door. There, on the very threshold, lay the body of Howard Dean, the murderer. His eyes were bulging horribly from their sockets, and his mouth was half open in a terrible grimace of fear and terror. His hand clutched a small roll of banknotes. He was dead, all too evidently dead. I telephoned for the police, and when they came in response to my message, they asked me how I accounted for the presence of Dean in my home. I told them all that I knew of the whole diabolical affair, but whether Dean had returned to my house to recover something, the roll of bills perhaps, that he had dropped in his flight, or whether he came back to ransack the place at leisure, or whether my dead friend sought him out and transported his body to the corridor near my room, I did not know. When I told them everything, including my belief that the ghost had caused Dean's death by intense fright, they ridiculed the story. They said that death had resulted most likely from a fatal seizure of apoplexy that had occurred while the man was robbing my house. I wish I could accept their view, but I can still visualize too plainly Dean's fearful corpse with its distended eyes and distorted features, and I know of no possible human explanation for that blood-spattered confession which is now in the possession of the police. The end of Signed by a Ghost by William Edmund Fillory. Two Military Executions by Ambrose Bierce. In the spring of the year 1862, General Buell's big army lay in camp, licking itself into shape for the campaign which resulted in the victory at Shiloh. It was a raw, untrained army, although some of its fractions had seen hard enough service, with a good deal of fighting, in the mountains of western Virginia and in Kentucky. The war was young, and soldiering a new industry, imperfectly understood by the young American of the period, who found some features of it not altogether to his liking. Chief among these was an essential part of discipline, subordination. To one imbued from infancy with the fantastic fallacy that all men are born equal, unquestioning submission to authority was not easily mastered, and the American volunteer soldier in his green and salad days is among the worst known. That is how it happened that one of Buell's men, Private Bennett Story Green, committed the indiscretion of striking his officer. Later in the war he would not have done that. Like Sir Andrew Ogcheek, he would have seen him damned first. But time for reformation of his military manners was denied him, and he was promptly arrested on complaint of the officer, tried by court-martial, and sentenced to be shot. "You might have thrashed me and let it go at that," said the condemned man to the complaining witness. "That is what you used to do at school, when you were plain Will Dudley, and I was as good as you. Nobody saw me strike you. Discipline would not have suffered much." "Ben Green, I guess you're right about that," said the lieutenant. "Will you forgive me? That is what I came to see you about." There was no reply, and an officer, putting his head in at the door of the guard tent where the conversation had occurred, explained that the time allowed for the interview had expired. The next morning, when, in the presence of the whole brigade, Private Green was shot to death by a squad of his comrades, Lieutenant Dudley turned his back upon the sorry performance and muttered a prayer for mercy, in which himself was included. A few weeks afterwards, as Buell's leading division was being ferried over the Tennessee River to assist in succoring Grant's beaten army, night was coming on, black and stormy. Through the wreck of battle the division moved, inch by inch, in the direction of the enemy, who had withdrawn a little to reform his lines. But for the lightning, the darkness was absolute. Never for a moment did it cease, and even when the thunder did not crack and roar, were heard the moans of the wounded, among whom the men felt their way with their feet, and upon whom they stumbled in the gloom. The dead were there too. There were dead aplenty. In the first faint gray of morning, when the swarming advance had paused to resume something of definition as a line of battle, and skirmishers had been thrown forward, word was passed along to call the roll. The first sergeant of Lieutenant Dudley's company stepped up to the front and began to name the men in alphabetical order. He had no written roll, but a good memory. The men answered to their names as he ran down the alphabet to G. Gorham? Here. Grayrock? Here. The sergeant's good memory was affected by habit. Green? Here. The response was clear, distinct, unmistakable. A sudden movement, an agitation of the entire company front, as from an electric shock, attested to the startling character of the incident. The sergeant paled and paused. The captain strode quickly to his side and said sharply, "Call that name again." Apparently, the Society of Psychical Research is not first in the field of curiosity concerning the unknown. Bennett Green. Here. All faces turned in the direction of the familiar voice, and two men between whom, in order of stature, Green had commonly stood in line, turned and squarely confronted each other. Once more, commanded the inexorable investigator, and once more came, a trifle tremulously, the name of the dead man. Bennett Story Green. Here. At that instant a single rifle shot was heard, away to the front, beyond the skirmish line, followed, almost attended, by the savage hiss of an approaching bullet, which passed through the line, struck audibly, punctuating, as with a full stop, the captain's exclamation, "What the devil does it mean?" Lieutenant Dudley pushed through the ranks from his place in the rear. "It means this," he said, throwing open his coat and displaying a visible broadening stain of crimson on his breast. His knees gave out. He fell awkwardly and lay dead. A little later the regiment was ordered out of line to relieve the congested front, and through some misplay in the game of battle was not again under fire. Nor did Bennett Green, expert in military executions, ever again signify his presence at one.
The Striding Place by Gertrude Atherton. Weagle, continental and detached, tired early of grouse shooting, to stand propped against a sod fence while his host's workmen routed up the birds with long poles and drove them toward the waiting guns, made him feel himself a parody on the ancestors who had roamed the moors and forests of this West Riding of Yorkshire in hot pursuit of game worth the killing. But when in England in August he always accepted whatever proffered for the season, and invited his host to shoot pheasants on his estates in the south. The amusements of life, he argued, should be accepted with the same philosophy as its ills. It had been a bad day. A heavy rain had made the moor so spongy that it fairly sprang beneath the feet. Whether or not the grouse had haunts of their own, wherein they were immune from rheumatism, the bag had been small. The women, too, were an unusually dull lot, with the exception of a new-minded debutante who bothered Weigel at dinner by demanding the verbal restoration of the vague paintings on the vaulted roof above them. But it was no one of these things that sat on Weigel's mind as, when the other men went up to bed, he let himself out of the castle and sauntered down to the river. His intimate friend, the companion of his boyhood, the chum of his college days, his fellow-traveler in many lands, the man for whom he possessed stronger affection than for all men, had mysteriously disappeared 2 days ago, and his track might have sprung to the upper air for all the trace he had left behind him. He had been a guest on the adjoining estate during the past week, shooting with the fervor of a true sportsman, making love in the intervals to Adeline Cavan, and apparently in the best of spirits. As far as was known, there was nothing to lower his mental mercury, for his rent roll was a large one. Miss Cavan blushed whenever he looked at her, and, being one of the best shots in England, he was never happier than in August. The suicide theory was preposterous, all agreed, and there was as little reason to believe him murdered. Nevertheless, he had walked out of March Abbey 2 nights ago without hat or overcoat, and had not been seen since. The country was being patrolled night and day. 100 keepers and workmen were beating the woods and poking the bogs on the moors, but as yet not so much as a handkerchief had been found. Weigel did not believe for a moment that Wyatt Gifford was dead, and although it was impossible not to be affected by the general uneasiness, he was disposed to be more angry than frightened. At Cambridge, Gifford had been an incorrigible practical joker, and by no means had outgrown the habit. It would be like him to cut across the country in his evening clothes, board a cattle train, and amuse himself touching up the picture of the sensation in West Riding. However, Weigel's affection for his friend was too deep to companion with tranquillity in the present state of doubt, and instead of going to bed early with the other men, he had determined to walk until ready for sleep. He went down to the river and followed the path through the woods. There was no moon, but the stars sprinkled their cold light upon the pretty belt of water flowing placidly past wood and ruin, between green masses of overhanging rocks or sloping banks tangled with tree and shrub, leaping occasionally over stones with the harsh notes of an angry scold, to recover its equanimity the moment the way was clear again. It was very dark in the depths where Weigel trod. He smiled as he recalled a remark of Gifford's. An English wood is like a good many other things in life, very promising at a distance, but a hollow mockery when you get within. You see daylight on both sides, and the sun freckles the very bracken. Our woods need the night to make them seem what they ought to be, what they once were, before our ancestors' descendants demanded so much more money, in these so much more various days. Weigel strolled along smoking, thinking of his friend, his pranks, many of which had done more credit to his imagination than this, and recalling conversations that had lasted the night through. Just before the end of the London season, they had walked the streets one hot night after a party, discussing the various theories of the soul's destiny. That afternoon they had met at the coffin of a college friend, whose mind had been a blank for the past 3 years. Some months previously they had called at the asylum to see him. His expression had been senile, his face imprinted with the record of debauchery. In death the face was placid, intelligent, without ignoble lineation, the face of the man they had known at college. Weigel and Gifford had no time to comment there, and the afternoon and evening were full, but coming forth from the house of festivity together, they had reverted almost at once to the topic. "I cherish the theory," Gifford had said, "that the soul sometimes lingers in the body after death. During madness, of course, it is an impotent prisoner, albeit a conscious one. Fancy its agony and its horror! What more natural than that, when the life spark goes out, the tortured soul should take possession of the vacant skull and triumph once more for a few hours while old friends look their last. It has had time to repent while compelled to crouch and behold the result of its work, and it has shrived itself into a state of comparative purity. If I had my way, I should stay inside my bones until the coffin had gone into its niche, that I might obviate for my poor old comrade the tragic impersonality of death. And I should like to see justice done to it, as it were, to see it lowered among its ancestors with the ceremony and solemnity that are its due. I am afraid that if I dissevered myself too quickly, I should yield to curiosity and hasten to investigate the mysteries of space." You believe in the soul as an independent entity, then? That it and the vital principle are not one and the same? Absolutely. The body and soul are twins, life comrades, sometimes friends, sometimes enemies, but always loyal in the last instance. Some day, when I am tired of this world, I shall go to India and become a Mahatma solely for the pleasure of receiving proof during life of this independent relationship. Suppose you were not sealed up properly, and returned after one of your astral flights to find your earthly part unfit for habitation. It is an experiment I don't think I should care to try, unless even juggling with soul and flesh had palled. That would not be an uninteresting predicament. I should rather enjoy experimenting with broken machinery. The high, wild roar of water smote suddenly upon Weagle's ear and checked his memories. He left the wood and walked out on the huge slippery stones which nearly closed the river wharf at this point, and watched the waters boil down into the narrow pass with their furious, untiring energy. The black quiet of the woods rose high on either side. The stars seemed colder and whiter just above. On either hand their perspectives of the river might have run into a rayless cavern. There was no lonelier spot in England, nor one which had the right to claim so many ghosts, if ghosts there were. Weagle was not a coward, but he recalled uncomfortably the tales of those that had been done to death in the Strid. Wordsworth's boys of Egremont had been disposed of by the practical Whitaker, but countless others more venturesome than wise had gone down into the narrow boiling course, never to appear in the still pool a few yards beyond. Below the great rocks which formed the walls of the Strid was believed to be a natural vault, onto whose shelves the dead were drawn. The spot had an ugly fascination. Weagle stood, visioning skeletons, uncoffined and green, the home of the eyeless things which had devoured all that had covered and filled that rattling symbol of man's mortality. Then fell to wondering if anyone had attempted to leap the Strid of late. It was covered with slime. He had never seen it look so treacherous. He shuddered and turned away, impelled, despite his manhood, to flee the spot. As he did so, something tossing in the foam below the fall, something as white, yet independent of it, caught his eye and arrested his step. Then he saw that it was describing a contrary motion to the rushing water, an upward-backward motion. Weagle stood rigid, breathless. He fancied he heard the crackling of his hair. Was that a hand? It thrust itself still higher above the boiling foam, turning sideways, and 4 frantic fingers were distinctly visible against the black rock beyond. Weagle's superstitious terror left him. A man was there, struggling to free himself from the suction beneath the Strid, swept down doubtless but a moment before his arrival, perhaps as he stood with his back to the current. He stepped as close to the edge as he dared. The hand doubled as if in imprecation, shaking savagely in the face of that force which leaves its creatures to immutable law, then spread wide again, clutching, expanding, crying for help as audibly as the human voice. Weagle dashed to the nearest tree, dragged and twisted off a branch with his strong arms, and returned as swiftly to the Strid. The hand was in the same place, still gesticulating as wildly. The body was undoubtedly caught in the rocks below, perhaps already halfway along one of those hideous shelves. Weagle let himself down upon a lower rock, braced his shoulder against the mass beside him, then, leaning out over the water, thrust the branch into the hand. The fingers clutched it convulsively. Weagle tugged powerfully. His own feet dragged perilously near the edge. For a moment he produced no impression. Then an arm shot above the waters. The blood sprang to Weagle's head. He was choked with the impression that the Strid had him in her roaring hold, and he saw nothing. Then the mist cleared. The hand and arm were nearer, although the rest of the body was still concealed by the foam. Weagle peered out with distended eyes. The meager light revealed in the cuff links of a peculiar device. The fingers clutching the branch were as familiar. Weagle forgot the slippery stones, the terrible death if he stepped too far. He pulled with passionate will and muscle. Memories flung themselves into the hot light of his brain, trooping rapidly upon each other's heels, as in the thought of the drowning. Most of the pleasures of his life, good and bad, were identified in some way with his friend. Scenes of college days, of travel, where they had deliberately sought adventure and stood between one another and death upon more occasions than one, of hours of delightful companionship among the treasures of art, and others in the pursuit of pleasure, flashed like the changing particles of a kaleidoscope. Weagle had loved several women, but he would have flouted in these moments the thought that he had ever loved any woman as he loved Wyatt Gifford. There were so many charming women in the world, and in the 32 years of his life he had never known another man to whom he cared to give his intimate friendship. He threw himself on his face. His wrists were cracking. The skin was torn from his hands. The fingers still gripped the stick. There was life in them yet. Suddenly something gave way. The hand swung about, tearing the branch from Weagle's grasp. The body had been liberated and flung outward, though still submerged by the foam and spray. Weagle scrambled to his feet and sprang along the rocks, knowing that the danger from suction was over and that Gifford must be carried straight to the quiet pool. Gifford was a fish in the water and could live under it longer than most men. If he survived this, it would not be the first time that his pluck and science had saved him from drowning. Weagle reached the pool. A man in his evening clothes floated on it, his face turned towards a projecting rock over which his arm had fallen, upholding the body. The hand that had held the branch hung limply over the rock, its white reflection visible in the black water. Weagle plunged into the shallow pool, lifted Gifford in his arms, and returned to the bank. He laid the body down and threw off his coat that he might be the freer to practice the methods of resuscitation. He was glad of the moment's respite. The valiant life in the man might have been exhausted in that last struggle. He had not dared to look at his face, to put his ear to the heart. The hesitation lasted but a moment. There was no time to lose. He turned to his prostrate friend. As he did so, something strange and disagreeable smote his senses. For a half-moment he did not appreciate its nature. Then his teeth cracked together, his feet, his outstretched arms pointed towards the woods. But he sprang to the side of the man and bent down and peered into his face. There was no face. This striding place is called the Strid, a name which it took of yore. 1,000 years hath it borne the name, and it shall 1,000 more.
S.O.S. by Algernon Blackwood. It is a question how many witnesses shall be required to establish the veracity of an occurrence so singular, especially when one such witnesses is a dog. 3 of us, 2 men and a girl, had skimmed the snow-covered Jura slopes on our skis since noon, arriving toward 4 o'clock at the deserted chalet where the 4th was to meet us. Upon the arrival of that 4th hung all the future happiness of the girl, and he was to come from a village far away on the other side. The Christmas rendezvous had been carefully arranged. We had brought provisions for making a hot supper in the empty building, a lonely farmhouse used only in the summer, and our plan was to ski back all together by moonlight. "Put on your extra sweaters before you begin to cool," said the older man, coming round the corner with an armful of logs from the frozen woodpile. "I'll get the fire going. Here, Dot," turning to his niece. "Stack your skis and get the food out. He'll be hungry as a bear." The 3 of us bustled about over the crisp snow, and the older man had a wood fire blazing upon the great open hearth in less than 10 minutes. The interior of the big room lit up. Shadows flew overhead among the rafters, and shafts of cheery yellow light flashed even into the recesses of the vaulted barn that opened out into the cow sheds in the rear. Outside, the dusk visibly deepened from one minute to the next. The cold was bitter, but our heated bodies fairly steamed. The big St. Bernard ran, sniffing and prancing after each of us in turn, and from time to time flew up the mounds of snow outside where he stood, with head flung back and muzzle up, staring against the sunset. He knew perfectly well that someone else was expected, and the direction from which he would come. The effect of the firelight streaming through the door and cracks of muffled window into the last hour of daylight was peculiar. Day and night met together on the threshold of the chalet, under the shadows of that enormous snow-laden roof. For the sun was now below the rim of the Souchez ridges, flaming with a wonderful sheet of red and yellow light over the huge white plateau, and the isolated trees threw vague shadows that easily ran into a length of half a kilometer. Rapidly they spread, assuming monstrous shapes, half animal, half human, then, deceiving the sight, merged into the strange uniform glow that lies upon a snowfield in the twilight. The forest turned purple. The crests of the pines cut into the sky like things of steel and silver. Everything shone, crackled, sparkled. The cold increased. "Dorothy, where are you going?" sounded the older man's voice from the door, for the girl was out on her skis again. Her slim young figure, topped by the pointed white snow-cap, was sprite-like. "Just a little way over the slopes, to meet him," came her reply. She seemed to float above the snow, not on it. With decision, he called her in, and it was the warning in his tone that perhaps made her obey. "Better rest," he said briefly. "We've a long run home in the moonlight." On her skis she came sishing back down the gleaming slope to his side, neat and graceful, her shadow shooting ahead like black lightning, enormously elongated. "The Coeur d'Alene precipices, besides, lie over that way," he continued. "They begin without warning, a sheer drop, and nothing to show the edge." "I know them," she said, pouting a little. "He knows them too," her uncle answered, putting a hand on her shoulder. "He'll take the higher slopes. He'll get around all right." He had noticed the look in her soft brown eyes that betrayed it was the merest passing lash, an eagerness lying too close upon the verge of anxiety. "Harry knows these ridges even better than I do." He helped her stack the skis, then turned to whistle in the dog, which had stayed behind on the summit of the slope she had just left, and it was at this instant, I think, that I first suddenly became aware of an unusual significance lying behind the little scene. Such moments are beyond explanation or analysis. One can only report them. They pertain, some hold, to a kind of vision. I can merely affirm that the flash came to me in this wise. I saw the big dog, his outline sharply silhouetted against the skyline, and his head turned westward, refusing for the first time that day to obey instantly a whistle that for him was a summons always to be obeyed. His master, noticing nothing, had already gone inside, but the girl saw what I saw, caught a flash similar to my own, and recognized in the animal's insignificant disobedience a corroboration of something in herself that touched uneasiness. I cannot prove it. She has never spoken of it, only as she stood there a moment, with the sunset in her face and her tumbled hair half over her eyes, I intercepted the swift glance that ran upward to the St. Bernard, traveled beyond him to the huge distant snow slopes, and then fell upon me. It was love, perhaps, that carried and interpreted thus the instantaneous, wireless message, the love that lay undelivered in my heart, as in her own, and since she was forsworn already, lay unrecognized. In view of what followed, I cannot wholly say. My sight held clearer and steadier than her own, and it came to me that my strange perception, sharpened to bitter sweetness, as if by sacrifice, approached possibly to some kind of inferior divination of the wounded soul. The next minute the great dog came bounding down, and we entered the chalet together, busying ourselves with fire, benches, table, and supper. The portable little kettle of aluminum already steamed upon the hearth. With us, with myself at any rate, came into the cozy fire, lit interior a sensation that was new. I felt the terror and desolation of these vast, snow-covered mountains, immense, trackless, silent, lying away from the world of men below the coming stars. Winter, like a winter of the polar regions, held them fast. In the brilliant sunshine of the day they had been friendly, enticing, sympathetic. Now, with the icy dusk creeping over their bare white faces, the freezing wind sifted with long sighs through the forests below, and the silent terror of the frost stalking from cliff to ridge with his head among the stars. They turned terrible. With the coming of the night they awoke to their true power. They showed their teeth. Our own insignificance became curiously emphasized. I thought of the Croix de Van precipices, sweeping crater-like with their semicircle of dark grandeur, a gulf of snowdrifts about their dreadful lips, 600 feet of shadows yawning within, and shuddered. "You're cold," said Dot softly, pulling me to the fire where she warmed her steaming boots. "I'm cold too." We piled the wood on, the flames leaped and crackled, shadows flew among the rafters. "Harry's due any minute," said her uncle. "We'll drop the eggs in as soon as we hear his whistle." He stooped down to pat the St. Bernard, which lay with head stretched on his forepaws before the fire, staring, listening. "You'll hear him first," he laughed cheerily, giving the beast a resounding pat. "Long before we do." The dog growled low, making no other response to a caress that usually brought him leaping to his master's breast. We heard the wind keening round the wooden walls, rushing with a faint whistle over the roof, and we drew closer to the fire. For a long time no one spoke. The minutes passed and passed. It was then, quite suddenly, that we heard a step in the snow, but not before the dog had heard it first, and he bounded to his feet with a growl that was more like a human roar than any animal sound I have ever heard. He fairly leaped toward the door, and the same second Dot and I were also upon our feet. "What's the matter?" exclaimed her uncle, startled and surprised. "That's only wind, or snow falling from the roof." Behind us the wooden walls gave out sharp, crackling reports as the heated air made them expand, but in my heart something turned to ice with a cold that lay beyond all cold of winter. The terror I at first experienced, however, was not for myself, but for this soft, brown-eyed little maid who shot so swiftly by me and opened the heavy door. I was ready to catch her, ready to protect and shield, yet knowing by some strange authority within me that she stood already safe, held by a power that lay beyond all little efforts of my own. For into that great fire-lit interior stepped at once the figure of a peasant, large, uncouth, lumbering, his face curiously concealed either by the play of the shadows or by the fall of his hair and beard, to this day I know not which, filling the threshold with his bulk, the freezing wind rushing in past his great sheathed legs, and an eddy of dry snow veiling him like a flying cloak beyond. He stood there a second, with an atmosphere of power about him that seemed to dwarf everything, and of such commanding stature that into my mind, bewildered and confused a little with the sudden entrance, ran the thought of bleak and towering peak of mountain. It came to me that the chalet must crumble, the huge beams split and fall upon our heads. There was a rush of freezing wind, a touch of ice, and at the same time I was aware of some strange, intolerable beauty, as of wild nature, that made me hide my eyes. It was only long afterward that I remembered that there was no snow upon his feet, that his eyes remained hidden, and also that he spoke not a word. "The door's blown open!" cried the uncle. "Oh, for God's sake!" All this, moreover, in the 10th of a second, for immediately I saw that the St. Bernard was bounding round the figure with an unfeigned delight that knew no fear, and next, that he had stretched his arms out toward the girl with a gesture of tenderness and invitation possible only in this whole world to the arms of woman. Terrible, yet inconceivably winning, was that gesture, as of a child. At the same moment, to my amazement, she had leaped forward and was gone. With her, barking and leaping, went the St. Bernard dog. "Dot, you silly child! Where in the world are you going? Do shut the door. It's not Harry yet. It was a false alarm." It was the matter-of-fact tone on her uncle's voice that led me into the secret that only she, I, and the dog had witnessed anything at all. "I'll go with her and see her safe," I shouted back, and it was only then, as I turned toward the door again after saying it, that I understood that no one was standing there, and her leap had really been a springing run toward the corner where her skis lay. Already I saw they were on her feet. She was away. I saw the dog bounding over the frozen slope beside her. He was a little in front. He held her skirt in his teeth, guidingly. In that pale, wintry light of the rising moon, I saw their two outlines against the snow. They were alone. "Bring brandy and a blanket," I had the sense to call back into the room, and was after her in my turn. But the frozen fastenings of my skis had never seemed so obstinate. It was a whole minute before I was whizzing down the mile-long slope. The speed was tremendous, and the skis skidded on the crust. She left only faint indications of her trail. It was the barking of the dog that guided me best, and far below me in the yellow moonlight, the little speeding dot of black that showed me where she flew, heading straight for the Crow divan. At any other time, such a descent as we two then made would have been sheer lunacy, even in daylight. The tearing speed, the angle of the huge slope, the iciness of that gleaming crust were all invitations to disaster, and with the gaping chasm of the Crow divan laying waiting at the bottom, it was simply a splendid race into suicide. The water poured from my eyes. The frozen mounds whipped by like giant white waves, and no sooner was the black line of some isolated pine tree sighted than it was passed, like the telegraph poles to an express train. Only the yellow face of the big rising moon held steady. She had soon outstripped the dog, and as I shot past him, wildly cantering, with his tongue out and streaming, jaws open, he caught vainly at my puttees. The next moment he was 100 yards behind me. But Dot, guided by some power that the mountains put into her little feet, knew her direction well, and went as straight as a die to the edge of that awful gulf, then stopped dead, buried to her neck in a drift that climbed wave-like upon the very lips of the chasm. It stopped her as 10 minutes before it had also stopped another, coming down from the slopes that lay to the westward. I saw the whole of the valley gaping at our very feet as a successful telemark flung me backward beside her just in the nick of time. "Quick!" I heard her cry. "He's still sliding." It was then that I realized that the third body, lying there unconscious where the drift had likewise stopped it, was slowly moving with the weight of snow toward the edge. One ski already projected horribly over the actual brink. I heard a mass of snow detach itself and drop even as she said it. It took less than a second to detach my belt and fasten it to his leg. But even then, I firmly believe the strain of our slow pulling must have landed us all three into the gulf below, had not the arrival of the St. Bernard put a different complexion upon the scene. It was the grandest thing I have ever witnessed. A second he stood there, the supreme instinct of his noble race judging the problem. He knew the softness of the drift that must engulf him if he advanced. He also saw it sliding, very slowly, like a courageous human being on all fours, calculating distance, angle, and tensions, as it were, by his superb animal divination. He crawled round to the other side. He crept gingerly along the very edge, his teeth fastened upon the boot and ski straps. We pulled together. God, I cannot understand to this day how it was that the four of us were not gone. He knew that splendid dumb creature. We merely followed in his magnificent lead. A moment later, we were safe on hard, solid snow. As we lay back exhausted, the snow immediately at our feet slid with a hiss and disappeared into the valley hundreds of feet below. But the St. Bernard, still pulling carefully and gently by himself, was next busily licking the boy's white face and breathing his heat upon him, when the help arrived with the brandy and the blankets. I believe it was the tireless and incessant attentions of that great dog that really saved the life, for he lay upon the form with his whole body, keeping him warm and letting go only when he understood that the blankets and our arms carrying him to the chalet might replace his own self-sacrificing love. I heard a voice crying outside the door in the wind, she told me afterwards. It was his voice, you see, and it called me by name. I don't know what guided me to the place, for I think I shut my eyes the whole way till I fell at his side.
The Sphinx by Edgar Allan Poe. During the dread reign of cholera in New York, I had accepted the invitation of a relative to spend a fortnight with him in the retirement of his cottage ornée on the banks of the Hudson. We had here around us all the ordinary means of summer amusement, and what with rambling in the woods, sketching, boating, fishing, bathing, music, and books, we should have passed the time pleasantly enough. But for the fearful intelligence which reached us every morning from the populous city, not a day elapsed which did not bring us news of the decease of some acquaintance. Then, as the fatality increased, we learned to expect daily the loss of some friend. At length, we trembled at the approach of every messenger. The very air from the south seemed to us redolent with death. That pulsing thought, indeed, took entire possession of my soul. I could neither speak, think, nor dream of anything else. My host was of a less excitable temperament, and although greatly depressed in spirits, exerted himself to sustain my own. His richly philosophical intellect was not at any time affected by unrealities. To the substances of terror he was sufficiently alive, but of its shadows he had no apprehension. His endeavors to arouse me from the condition of abnormal gloom into which I had fallen were frustrated, in great measure, by certain volumes which I had found in his library. These were of a character to force into germination whatever seeds of hereditary superstition lay latent in my bosom. I had been reading these books without his knowledge, and thus he was often at a loss to account for the forcible impressions which had been made upon my fancy. A favorite topic with me was the popular belief in omens, a belief which, at this one epoch of my life, I was almost seriously disposed to defend. On this subject we had long and animated discussions, he maintaining the utter groundlessness of faith in such matters, I contending that a popular sentiment arising with absolute spontaneity well, that is to say without apparent traces of suggestion, had in itself the unmistakable elements of truth, and was entitled to as much respect as that intuition which is the idiosyncrasy of an individual man of genius. The fact is, that soon after my arrival at the cottage, there had occurred to myself an incident so entirely inexplicable, and which had in it so much of the portentous character, that I might have been excused for regarding it as an omen. It appalled, and at the same time so confounded and bewildered me, that many days elapsed before I could make up my mind to communicate the circumstances to my friend. Near the close of an exceedingly warm day, I was sitting, book in hand, at an open window, commanding through a long vista of river banks a view of a distant hill, the face of which, nearest my position, had been denuded by what is termed a landslide of the principal portion of its trees. My thoughts had long been wandering from the volume before me to the gloom and desolation of the neighboring city. Uplifting my eyes from the page, they fell upon the naked face of the bill, and upon an object, upon some living monster of hideous conformation, which very rapidly made its way from the summit to the bottom, disappearing finally in the dense forest below. As this creature first came into sight, I doubted my own sanity, or at least the evidence of my own eyes. And many minutes passed before I succeeded in convincing myself that I was neither mad nor in a dream. Yet, when I described the monster, which I distinctly saw and calmly surveyed through the whole period of its progress, my readers, I fear, will feel more difficulty in being convinced of these points than even I did myself. Estimating the size of the creature by comparison with the diameter of the large trees which it had passed, the few giants of the forest which had escaped the fury of the landslide, I concluded it to be far larger than any ship of the line in existence. I say ship of the line because the shape of the monster suggested the idea. The hull of one of our 74 might convey a very tolerable conception of the general outline. The mouth of the animal was situated at the extremity of the proboscis, some 60 or 70 feet in length, and about as thick as the body of an ordinary elephant. Near the roots of this trunk was an immense quantity of black shaggy hair, more than could have been supplied by the coats of a score of buffaloes, and projecting from this hair downwardly and laterally sprang two gleaming tusks, not unlike those of a wild boar, but of infinitely greater dimensions. Extending forward, parallel with the proboscis, and on each side of it, was a gigantic staff, 30 or 40 feet in length, formed seemingly of pure crystal and in the shape of a perfect prism. It reflected in the most gorgeous manner the rays of the declining sun. The trunk was fashioned like a wedge with the apex to the earth. From it there were outspread 2 pairs of wings, each wing nearly 100 yards in length, one pair being placed above the other, and all thickly covered with metal scales, each scale apparently some 10 or 12 feet in diameter. I observed that the upper and lower tiers of wings were connected by a strong chain. But the chief peculiarity of the horrible thing was the representation of a death's head, which covered nearly the whole surface of its breast, and which was accurately traced in glaring white upon the dark round of the body, as if it had been there carefully designed by an artist. While I regarded the terrific animal, and more especially the appearance on its breast, with a feeling of horror and awe, with a sentiment of forthcoming evil which I found it impossible to quell by any effort of the reason, I perceived the huge jaws of the extremity of the proboscis suddenly expand themselves, and from them there proceeded a sound so loud and so expressive of woe that it struck upon my nerves like a knell, and as the monster disappeared at the foot of the hill, I fell at once fainting to the floor. Upon recovering, my first impulse, of course, was to inform my friend of what I had seen and heard, and I can scarcely explain what feeling of repugnance it was which, in the end, operated to prevent me. At length one evening, some 3 or 4 days after the occurrence, we were sitting together in the room in which I had seen the apparition, I occupying the same seat at the same window, and he lounging at the sofa near at hand. The association of the place and time impelled me to give him an account of the phenomenon. He heard me to the end, at first laughed heartily, and then lapsed into an excessively grave demeanor, as if my insanity was a thing beyond suspicion. At this instant I again had a distinct view of the monster, to which, with a shout of absolute terror, I now directed his attention. He looked eagerly, but maintained that he saw nothing, although I designated minutely the course of the creature as it made its way down the naked face of the hill. I was now immeasurably alarmed, for I considered the vision either as an omen of my death, or worse, as the forerunner of an attack of mania. I threw myself passionately back in the chair, and for some moments buried my face in my hands. When I uncovered my eyes, the apparition was no longer apparent. My host, however, had in some degree resumed the calmness of his demeanor, and questioned me very rigorously in respect to the confirmation of the visionary creature. When I had fully satisfied him on this head, he sighed deeply, as if relieved of some intolerable burden, and went on to talk, with what I thought a cruel calmness, of various points of speculative philosophy, which had heretofore formed subject of discussion between us. I remember him insisting very especially, among other things, upon the idea that the principal source of error in all human investigations lay in the liability of the understanding to underrate or to overvalue the importance of an object through mere mismeasurement of its propinquity. To estimate properly, for example, he said, the influence to be exercised on mankind at large by thorough diffusion of democracy, the distance of the epoch at which such diffusion may possibly be accomplished should not fail to form an item in the estimate. Yet, can you tell me one writer on the subject of government who has ever thought this particular branch of subject worthy of discussion at all? He here paused for a moment, stepped to a bookcase, and brought forth one of the ordinary synopses of natural history, requesting me then to exchange seats with him, that he might better distinguish the fine print of the volume. He took my armchair at the window, and, opening the book, resumed his discourse very much in the same tone as before. But for your exceeding minuteness, he said, in describing the monster, I might have never had it in my power to demonstrate to you what it was. In the first place, let me read to you a schoolboy account of the genus Sphinx, of the family Crespularia, of the order Lepidodera, of the class of Insecta, or insects. The account runs thus. 4 membranous wings covered with little covered scales of metallic appearance, mouth forming a rolled proboscis, produced by an elongation of the jaws, upon the sides of which are found the rudiments of mandibles and downy palpi. The inferior wings retained the superior by a stiff hair. Antenna in the form of an elongated club, prismatic. Abdomen pointed. The death's-headed sphinx has occasioned much terror among the vulgar at times, by the melancholy kind of cry which it utters, and the insignia of death which it wears upon its corslet. He here closed the book, and leaned forward in the chair, placing himself accurately in the position which I had occupied at the moment of beholding the monster. "Ah, here it is," he presently exclaimed. "It is reascending the face of the hill, and a very remarkable-looking creature I admit it to be. Still, it is by no means so large or so distant as you imagined it, for the fact is that as it wriggles its way up this thread, which some spider has wrought along the window sash, I find it to be about the 16th of an inch in its extreme length, and also about the 16th of an inch distance from the pupil of my eye.